That rate cut everyone expected, it's probably not coming. And if that sounds like a mild disappointment, well, think again, because what happens next could throw Canada's entire economy into chaos. You've been told that interest rates would come down, that inflation was under control, that better mortgage rates were just around the corner. But the Bank of Canada is caught between rising core inflation, relentless government spending, and a labor market that, well, isn't doing too hot. Today, we're going to talk about how interest rates really work and why they're more psychological than you might think, why the rate cut isn't coming, or at least I don't think it is, despite earlier predictions, how inflation, jobs, and government spending are keeping the Bank of Canada stuck, and what it means for real estate and mortgages here in Calgary. Let's start with the basics. The Bank of Canada sets something called the overnight lending rate. This is the foundation for all borrowing costs in the country, from mortgages to car loans to business credit cards. It's updated 8 times a year on a fixed schedule, and the next update is July 30th. When the Bank of Canada raises rates, borrowing gets more expensive, which slows down spending. When they cut rates, borrowing gets cheaper, which boosts spending and helps stimulate growth. They do this to manage inflation. Since 1991, the Bank of Canada's job has been to keep inflation around 2%, within that 1 to 3% target band. But interest rates aren't just economic tools, they're actually psychological levers. When the bank hikes, consumers panic. When they cut, they kind of take a breath. But it takes 12 to 18 months for a rate change to actually trickle through the economy. So everything in the bank does is based on expectations and predictions about the future, not just what's happening today. Earlier this year, most economists expected at least 2 to 3 rate cuts by the fall, but today that expectation has flipped completely. So if you're thinking the Bank of Canada should cut rates on July 30th, you're probably wondering, why aren't they doing it? Isn't the economy slowing down? Aren't people struggling? The job numbers are getting better, but people don't feel like things are improving. They're feeling stuck, underwater, and concerned. I talked about this in depth in my latest video, breaking down the disconnect between the headlines and what people are actually experiencing. If you want more information on the latest jobs report, you can go watch that video next. It's linked below. As I mentioned there, though, the truth is many Calgarians are working 2 or more jobs just to cover basic expenses. We're seeing youth unemployment in Alberta holding at 16.4%, one of the highest in the country, and new jobs emerge that are increasingly precarious or vulnerable to automation and AI. So when you see job growth, but your cost of living keeps climbing and work doesn't feel secure, yeah, it's frustrating. The Bank of Canada knows all of this. They have all of the stats. They aren't trying to hurt people, but their job is to control inflation. And right now, inflation is proving stubborn. Even though headline inflation in June came in at 1.9%, it was artificially pushed down by the removal of the carbon tax. Without that, we'd be closer to 2.6%. And even more importantly, core inflation, which strips out the volatile stuff, is still just under 3%, bumping right up against the bank's comfort zone. They're also seeing something called broadening inflation, where over 55% of the goods in the consumer price index are rising faster than 3% annually, and that is a big red flag. And the government spending, woo! Even as Canadians pull back their spending and have personal budgets, the government is ramping up. Billions are flowing into infrastructure, housing initiatives, green energy programs, and subsidies. Well, that's the plan at least, or do they actually have a plan, or are they just like, because if there is a strategy here, it's hard to see it from where most of us are standing. While the bank sees a softening in some areas, they also see signs that cutting now could fire up inflation again. I said I thought they would continue to cut rates, and I was wrong. It comes with mixed emotions because I like seeing the rate go down on my own mortgage, but rate cuts also indicate the economy is not doing great, which it isn't. But it's not just about who's struggling today. It's about not making things worse tomorrow. If they cut too soon, they risk reheating housing markets, especially in Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary. Do they though? Cutting too soon means they could also lose credibility with investors and markets and having to hike rates again later, which could be even more painful. I think the bank is choosing to hold firm because they believe that risk of cutting too early is greater than the relief it might bring. I get it. It's confusing when the headlines say record job gains, but you're watching friends lose work or taking on gig jobs just to stay afloat, or just even not getting hired after years of looking. In short, the data and the day-to-day reality don't always line up. And that's what's making this moment so difficult to navigate. Like, I think on July 30th, the Bank of Canada will pause. No cut, no hike, just hold. Because while some indicators are softening, jobs, consumer spending, inflation, and fiscal pressures are still too hot to justify a move. Markets have pulled back on their expectations too. As I mentioned earlier this year, traders were pricing in 3 to 4 cuts in 2024. Now they're barely pricing in one by October, and even that's shaky. You need to know though, this isn't about punishing consumers. It's about not letting inflation rebound, even if that means the short-term discomfort. If, say, inflation plunges or unemployment spikes, the outlook could shift. But barring a shock, I don't see them cutting until late fall at the earliest. So what does this mean here in Calgary? We'll likely continue to see prices shift downward as we see more supply come to market. I don't think the market would suddenly heat up again, even if there was a rate cut. Mortgage rates are hovering around the low to mid 4s, depending on your term. I will say the silver lining is, despite higher interest rates and rising unemployment, fewer consumers filed for insolvency in May. So that's proof that Canadians are handling debt burdens better than expected. It depends on your mortgage term, but the Bank of Canada data shows nearly 1 in 4 borrowers will actually see lower monthly payments when renewing this year. Most others can expect a 10 to 20% increase. So if you're a buyer waiting for a lower rate before entering the market, that window might not be open this summer. But here's what we can control: timing, strategy, information. People are expecting prices to fall drastically here in Calgary. I just don't see that. I do enjoy opening up this conversation in the comments though, because I do really appreciate all the different perspectives. So please go down there and tell me what you think is going to happen. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.